The high-pitched hum of the liquid chromatography mass spectrometer was the only constant note in the basement of Orlia Biopharma, a low-frequency vibration that rattled the fillings in a man's teeth if he stood too close to the exhaust vents. Vance Thorne stood precisely 3 feet away, his fingers wrapped around a lukewarm paper cup of bitter chicory coffee, watching the progress bar on his terminal creep toward 98%. Across the open-plan floor, separated by a double-paned glass partition that was supposed to keep the organic solvent vapors from drifting into the biology bay, Alastair Sterling was hunting. Vance did not look up when Alastair's orthotic soles squeaked against the green epoxy floor, nor did he flinch when Alastair's shadow fell across his keyboard. He simply took a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee. The liquid was cold, leaving a film of synthetic creamer on the roof of his mouth. In the reflection of the glass, Vance watched Alastair turn a small, amber glass vial over and over in his palm. The vial was completely blank except for a tiny, high-density square of black-and-white pixelated matrix printed on a chemical-resistant polyester label. There was no molecular structure hand-drawn in fine-tip Sharpie. There was no 7-digit internal compound registry number. There was only that silent, inscrutable grid of black squares on a white background. Alastair cleared his throat, a wet, rattling sound born of 20 years of inhaling poorly scrubbed silica dust. He held the vial up between his thumb and forefinger, right in Vance's line of sight. "Vance," Alastair said, his voice carrying that thin, tremulous strain of someone who believed every minor inconvenience was a personal conspiracy. "The assay plate for the JAK3 screening is due by 5. I have 40 of these in my rack, just these, no labels, no codes, just these." Vance turned his head slowly, his pale eyes resting on Alastair's collar, which was slightly frayed at the points. Vance wore his charcoal gray laboratory coat, the left cuff slightly stiffened by an old, washed-out spill of ethyl acetate. "They are labeled, Alastair, very precisely. That is a thermal transfer printed chemical inert two-dimensional data matrix. It complies with the new inventory standardization protocol." "I don't have a reader," Alastair said, his voice dropping an octave, trying to find the bass notes of authority he usually reserved for junior technicians. "The handheld scanner on my bench hasn't worked since the merger. I can't read a barcode with my eyes, Vance." "That is unfortunate," Vance replied, his voice a flat, level plane of professional concern. "But as we discussed, the manual transcription of chemical structures on microvials is a significant source of systemic quality assurance failure. We must be rigorous. The integrity of our pipeline depends on it." Alastair's jaw worked, a small knot of muscle twitching just below his ear. He knew exactly what Vance was doing, but there was absolutely nothing he could do about it. The trap had been laid 3 weeks prior, built from the very bricks of corporate bureaucracy Alastair had tried to use to bury Vance. The trouble had begun on a rainy Tuesday in late October, when the humidity in the building was so high that the analytical balances kept drifting. Vance had been working 70-hour weeks, his hands raw from the constant cycle of peeling off nitrile gloves and washing them with industrial soap that smelled of fake almonds. Orlia Biopharma was still in its lean, frantic startup phase. There was no dedicated compound management department, no team of high-throughput logistics specialists to receive the raw synthetic products from the organic chemists, dilute them into precise micromolar dimethyl sulfoxide solutions, and plate them out for the biological assays. Instead, the chemists were the pack mules. Vance would spend 4 days under a fume hood, breathing the faint, sweet smell of toluene, recrystallizing a series of novel pyrazolopyrimidines designed to inhibit a specific kinase pathway in rheumatoid arthritis. Once the white crystals were dried under a high vacuum, he would scrape them into small glass vials, write the internal code, something like Aminus 4902b, and draw the basic core scaffold on the side with a permanent marker. Then he would walk the box over to Alastair's bench, drop them into a wire basket, and return to his hood to start the next reaction. It was an informal system, built on trust and the shared misery of a startup. But Alastair didn't do informal. He treated his corner of the laboratory like a sovereign state, requiring signed transfer logs and 3 days' notice for any sample drop-off, despite the fact that his biological assays took less than 6 hours to run once the cells were thawed. On that Tuesday, Vance's vision was blurry from staring through a microscope at a recrystallization flask for 4 hours. He had 3 compounds to deliver: a pair of structural isomers that differed only by the position of a single fluorine atom on a benzyl ring, and a third control compound that was completely inactive. They were in identical amber vials. Vance's hand had slipped. The Sharpie was drying out, leaving a faint gray trail instead of a crisp black line. On the side of vial Aminus 5012, he had written Aminus 5021. A simple transposition of 2 digits. A mistake of 3 millimeters of ink. To anyone with a basic understanding of the project, the error would have been obvious within 5 minutes of looking at the initial screening data. The active compound would have shown 0 inhibition, and the inactive control would have lit up the assay plate like a Christmas tree. In a normal laboratory, Alistair would have walked 10 paces to the left, tapped Vance on the shoulder, and said, "Hey, did you swap these two?" The curves look inverted. Vance would have checked his lab notebook, corrected the sheet, apologized, and they would have gone to lunch. Instead, Alistair saw an opportunity to establish dominance. He did not walk the 10 paces. He did not send a quick message on the internal chat. Instead, he waited until Friday afternoon at 4:45 p.m. Vance had been packing his bag, looking forward to 48 hours of not smelling sulfur compounds, when the notification pinged on his phone. It was an email addressed to Dr. Rosalind Vance, the Vice President of Chemistry, and Dr. Gregory Finch, the Vice President of Biology. Vance was CC'd at the very bottom, below 3 different administrative assistants. The subject line was written in all capitals: critical systemic quality failure in lead optimization workflows. The email was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive corporate violence. Alistair had written 4 paragraphs detailing how unprofessional slipshod labeling practices had resulted in the complete invalidation of a high-throughput screening campaign, costing the company thousands of dollars in wasted reagents and immeasurable damage to project timelines. He didn't mention Vance by name until the final sentence, where he suggested that the medicinal chemistry team requires immediate remedial training on basic laboratory documentation standards to prevent such catastrophic lapses in the future. Vance sat back down at his desk. His heart wasn't racing, instead his chest felt cold, a heavy metallic sensation settling behind his ribs. He looked across the glass partition. Alistair's desk was already empty. He had sent the email and immediately slipped out the back door to catch his commuter train, leaving the bomb to detonate over the weekend. But Alistair had made a fundamental miscalculation about the nature of power at Orlia Biopharma. He assumed that because he had been there 6 months longer, his procedural complaints would carry weight with the executive team. He didn't realize that Rosalind Vance, the head of chemistry, had spent 20 years in the trenches of Big Pharma and despised nothing more than middle management posturing. At 7 p.m. that evening, Vance's phone buzzed again. It was a forward of Alistair's email from Rosalind, with Gregory Finch, the head of biology, also looped in. Rosalind's message was brief: "Vance, we know accidents happen. This guy seems like an absolute butthead who wants to play hallway cop. Just be extra careful with the marker from now on so we don't have to read another one of his novels. See you Monday." Underneath, Gregory Finch had added a short note: "Agree, let's keep the drama out of the pipeline. Vance, just double-check the vials before they leave your bench." Vance stared at the screen for a long time. The immediate threat was gone. His bosses didn't care about Alistair's grandstanding, but the insult remained. Alistair had tried to use the executive structure to humiliate him, to brand him as careless and unprofessional in front of the people who decided his promotions and his bonuses. In the silence of his apartment that weekend, while the rain beat a steady rhythm against his kitchen window, Vance began to construct his response. He did not get angry, he got digital. If Alistair wanted uncompromising professionalism and rigorous systemic standards, Vance would give him exactly that. He would give him a system so standard, so modern, and so thoroughly documented that it would become an inescapable iron cage. On Monday morning, Vance walked into Rosalind's office. He carried with him a 3-page proposal bound in a neat plastic folder. "Rosalind," Vance said, sitting down across from her desk, which was piled high with patent drafts. "I've been thinking about Alistair's email. And while his tone was defensive, he does have a point. Manual labeling is a relic of the past. If we scale up our pipeline next year as planned, we cannot rely on hand-drawn structures on the sides of microvials. It's a liability," Rosalind sighed, rubbing her temples. "Vance, don't let him get under your skin. We don't have the budget to buy an automated compound management robot." "We don't need a robot," Vance said, leaning forward. "We just need a protocol. I've researched it. We can buy a high-resolution thermal transfer barcode printer for $800. I can configure a relational database in Excel using some basic macro scripts. Every compound I synthesize will be assigned a unique 2D data matrix code. The label will contain nothing but that code. No structure, no handwritten text. It completely eliminates human error in transcription. Rosalind looked at the proposal, her eyes scanning the flowcharts Vance had meticulously drawn. And how does the biology team know what they're testing? Every time I drop off a rack of vials, I will upload a master manifest to the shared network drive, Vance explained, his voice smooth and reassuring. The manifest will link the barcode to the exact chemical structure, the concentration, and the batch number. All Alistair has to do is scan the vial, and the spreadsheet will automatically populate his assay templates. It's a closed-loop system. It's what Big Pharma uses. Rosalind's face brightened. It was exactly the kind of operational excellence she could highlight in her quarterly report to the board of directors. It looks incredibly clean, Vance. Let's do it. I'll approve the budget for the printer today. The printer arrived on Thursday. It was a heavy, industrial zebra unit that printed at 600 dots per inch on solvent-resistant white polyester tape. Vance spent his weekend not resting, but writing an Excel macro that was a marvel of passive-aggressive software engineering. The macro did indeed work, but Vance had designed the interface with a series of deliberate, highly professional obstacles. To find out what was in a vial, a user couldn't simply open the spreadsheet and look at a list. The spreadsheet was locked for editing, protected by a password only Vance and Rosalind possessed to prevent unauthorized alterations to the master registry. To query the database, the user had to open a specific macro-enabled workbook, click a button that opened a custom user form, and scan the barcode. The scanner would then input the 40-character alphanumeric string. But Vance had programmed the system so that it didn't just show the structure. It required the user to input the specific project code, the assay plate ID, and their own employee identification number before it would reveal the compound's identity. Furthermore, to prevent unauthorized data harvesting, the system would only allow one barcode to be scanned every 15 seconds. If a user scanned a second vial too quickly, a red dialog box would pop up. System locked. Security TIMEOUT. Please wait 14 seconds. For Vance, the system took an extra 5 minutes of work per batch. He would print the labels, stick them to the vials, and run his script to generate the manifest. It was a minor investment for an immense return. The trap was sprung on a freezing morning in mid-November. Vance had spent the previous week synthesizing a library of 200 distinct small molecule inhibitors for Alistair's primary screening campaign. It was the largest single delivery of the year. Normally, Vance would have labeled these in groups of 10, with clear handwritten identifiers like B-100 and 1 through B-300, sorted neatly in numerical order in a plastic box. Alistair would have been able to look at the box and immediately plate them out in order from left to right, without a single moment of hesitation. Instead, Vance delivered 10 boxes of 20 vials each. Every single vial was identical, a 1.4 milliliter clear glass tube with a black screw cap and a tiny 2D barcode on the bottom. The vials were randomized. There was no sequential order to the barcodes. They were randomly generated hexadecimal strings. Vance walked the boxes over to Alistair's bench. The biological team's area was quiet, save for the rhythmic clicking of an incubator door. Vance set the heavy cardboard shipping carton down on Alistair's desk with a soft, solid thud. "What's this?" Alistair asked, looking up from a paper he was reading. "The new library," Vance said, his voice bright and helpful. 200 compounds for the screening. I've uploaded the master manifest to the server. We've fully transitioned to the digital inventory system we discussed." Alistair blinked, looking at the neat rows of identical white-bottomed vials. "Where are the structures? How do I know which one is the reference standard?" "The reference standard is in there, Alistair," Vance said with a warm, professional smile. "You just need to scan them. The system will tell you exactly which well to put them in. It's foolproof. No more manual transcription errors." Alistair stared at the boxes, his face slowly turning the color of a wet sidewalk. "Vance, I don't have a scanner on my bench. I told you this." "Oh, that's right," Vance said, snapping his fingers in mock self-recollection. "Well, there's an old Honeywell scanner in the supply closet down by the vivarium. You might have to configure the drivers on your PC first, though. Sometimes the Windows 10 updates block the serial emulation. If you have any trouble, just contact it. They usually have a ticket turnaround time of 48 hours. Vance turned and walked back to his bench, his footsteps light. 10 minutes later, the first message appeared on the company's main Slack channel, visible to all 30 employees, including the founders and the executive team. Alastair Sterling, does anyone in the building have a working USB barcode reader? I have 200 samples that are completely unreadable without one. Urgent. No one replied for 40 minutes. Finally, a technician from the formulation group mentioned they had an old, corded scanner they used for tracking liquid nitrogen shipments. But the lens was scratched, and it only worked if you held the vial at a perfect 45-degree angle under a bright light. Vance watched from his desk as Alastair walked down the hall, fetched the scratch scanner, and began the long, agonizing process of setting it up. Because Vance had designed the Excel interface to require multiple fields of input for every single scan, project code, plate ID, user ID, and had hard-coded that 15-second security timeout between scans, Alastair could not simply run the scanner down the row of vials. He had to pick up a vial, hold it under the bright desk lamp, position the scratched scanner at a 45-degree angle until it finally beeped. Beep. Then Alastair had to turn to his screen, use his mouse to click the input field. Type in his employee ID, type in the project code, click Submit. The screen would whir for 3 seconds before showing the compound name, a V-8902. Alastair would then write a V-8902 on a sticky note, stick it to his rack, and pick up the next vial. If he worked with perfect efficiency without a single error, each vial took 45 seconds to identify. For 200 compounds, that was 2.5 hours of mind-numbing, repetitive manual labor. And if his finger slipped on the keyboard, or if he tried to scan the next vial too quickly to speed up the process, system locked. Security TIMOUT. Please wait 14 seconds. Vance sat at his bench, his ears tuned to the distant, rhythmic sound of Alastair's scanner. Beep, a long silence, a soft mutter of frustration. Beep, another silence. Then the distinct, sharp sound of Alastair hitting his spacebar with excessive force. By 2 p.m., Alastair's posture had completely collapsed. He was slumped over his keyboard, his shoulders hunched, his eyes bloodshot from staring at the alternating white and red boxes on his screen. The assay plates, which were usually prepared by noon, were still sitting empty in the sterile hood. At 3:30 p.m., Alastair walked over to Vance's bench. He didn't have his usual swagger. His lab coat was unbuttoned, and there was a dark smudge of toner on his right cheek. "Vance," Alastair said, his voice quiet, almost pleading, "we need to talk about this new system. It's not working. It's taking me 3 times as long to set up a plate. Can we please just go back to the handwritten labels for the weekly screens? I can't do this every time you drop off a library." Vance turned from his hood, holding a round-bottom flask containing a deep, amber liquid. He looked at Alastair with an expression of pure, unadulterated administrative regret. "I wish we could, Alastair," Vance said, his voice soft and sympathetic, "but I've already committed the chemistry team to this protocol. I actually presented our initial inventory metrics to Rosalind and Gregory this morning during our leadership alignment meeting. They were absolutely thrilled with the data. Gregory noted that having a digital audit trail of every single compound transfer is going to be crucial for our upcoming Series B funding round. It shows the investors we have clinical-grade quality systems in place." Alastair's eyes widened slightly. He looked as if he had just realized he had walked into a room where the floor was made of flypaper, and every step he took to free himself only mired him deeper. "But the scanner," Alastair whispered, "the scanner is broken. It takes 15 seconds between every scan." "Ah, yes," Vance said, nodding sagely. "That's a security feature to prevent database corruption from rapid double clicks. It's standard practice in relational database design. We have to protect the integrity of the registry. If we had a database collision, we might lose weeks of work. I'm sure you understand, given how strongly you feel about quality control." Vance set the flask down in a cork ring. "If you need a better scanner, I can write up a request for a high-performance Bluetooth reader. It's only $400. I can submit it to the purchasing committee next month. It should be approved by the start of the next quarter." Alastair stood there for several seconds, his mouth opening and closing slightly, like a fish that had been pulled from a deep, cold lake and laid on the dry pine needles of the shore. He realized with absolute clarity that there was no path of escape. If he complained to his boss, Gregory Finch, Gregory would simply tell him to follow the digital protocol that the VP of Chemistry had already praised in front of the board. If he refused to use the system, he would be failing to perform the assays, which would be a direct violation of his key performance indicators. He was trapped in a cage of his own design. He had demanded absolute, uncompromising, bureaucratic perfection, and Vance had built him a temple of it. For the next 3 months, the basement of Orlia Biopharma was defined by a new, steady rhythm. Every Monday and Thursday, Vance would deliver a rack of 80 to 100 barcoded vials. And every Monday and Thursday afternoon, Alistair would spend 3 hours at his desk, his arm moving in a mechanical arc, pick up, scan, wait, type, submit, record, while his plate sat cold in the incubator. Alistair's scientific output dropped by 40%. He no longer had time to attend the project planning meetings or write the internal review papers that had previously allowed him to claim credit for the team's discoveries. He was too busy scanning. His fingers developed a small callus on the side of his index finger from the constant friction of the microvials. He became a ghost in his own laboratory, a man consumed by the silent, digital demands of a spreadsheet that Vance had written over a single weekend while drinking cheap beer on his couch. Eventually, the startup grew. By the following spring, Orlia Biopharma had secured their Series B funding, and the first major purchase was a fully automated compound management system. A 6-foot-tall robotic freezer that received, sorted, and plated the compounds using a high-speed mechanical arm. Vance's spreadsheet was retired, replaced by a professional enterprise software suite that integrated directly with the liquid-handling robots. The barcode printer was moved to the storage closet, its thermal ribbon dusty and forgotten. But the lesson remained. Alistair never sent another email to the executive team. In fact, he rarely sent emails at all. Whenever there was a discrepancy in a screening curve or a suspected sample swap, Alistair would get up from his desk, walk the 10 yards to Vance's fume hood, and tap him gently on the shoulder. "Hey Vance," Alistair would say, his voice quiet, almost deferential as he pointed to his screen. "Do you mind if we just double-check this one together, just between us?" Vance would turn from his synthesis, slide his safety glasses down his nose, and smile. "Of course, Alistair, let's take a look. We wouldn't want any mistakes."